Sam profesor opšte savremene istorije na Filozofskom fakultetu, istoričar. Imam zadovoljstvo da vodim ovaj prvi panel. Imamo 3 izlaganja i za svako izlaganje imamo po 20 minuta i imat ćemo jedno 20 minuta za diskusiju. So, I'm very pleased to open our first panel. We have 3 papers, and for every paper we have about 20 minutes, and at the end we have 20 minutes for discussion. First paper is from Dr. Laurence Weinbaum, agreed upon Fables, the Perils of use of history, and the Shoah. Very short about the biography, just 2 elements. Dr. Weinbaum is graduated at Georgetown University and received PhD in history from Warsaw University, and he's founding chief editor of the Israel Journal of Foreign Affairs. And you have in this booklet, there's a bibliography if you want to know a little bit more about Professor Weinbaum's biography, please.
May I speak for the
Yeah. Dakle, dogovorene priče, opasnosti od korisne istorije i holokaust, dr. Laurence Weinbaum.
Dame i gospodo, Vaša ekscelencijo, dobro jutro. Drago mi je što sam danas ovdje s vama. I'm afraid that's all the Serbian you will get out of me without a sip of rakia, and it's too early in the day for that. I'm very honored to be here today because I believe that ensuring that the preservation of the material remnants of the Holocaust is the responsibility of all of us, and that we owe it to those who perished in Sajmištu to do what we can to ensure that future generations will learn what happened and to honor their memory. Sadly, as we know from the events of October 7th, what we call in Israel now Black Sabbath, such savagery has not been relegated to the history books, and I must tell you that even now in Israel, only a short time after these terrible killings, we are also discussing how to preserve the killing grounds for future generations. I would not be with you here today but for the efforts of my very dear friend Krinka Vidakovic Petrov, certainly one of the truly remarkable people one is fortunate to meet in life, let alone call a colleague or a friend, and I would like to thank her for all that she has done, is doing, and will do to ensure the success of this project. But I also wish her a speedy recovery. Brzo zdravi. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, even without the rakia. I would like to dedicate my remarks today to the memory of an outstanding scholar who passed away in November of 2022, but whose outstanding contributions to this discipline often go unrecognized. Professor Michael Shafir of the University of Cluj was the first scholar to identify and quantify the phenomenon that I am going to discuss today, and it is impossible to speak about it without reference to his nomenclatura. Early on in his path-breaking 2002 publication, he recognized how the Holocaust was being distorted in post-communist Europe and coined a number of terms to describe the way in which that was being done. I'm sorry that his name is not better known, but I hope that in the world to come he is pleased that we remember his scholarship today here in Belgrade. What is history but a fable agreed upon, asked the French author Bernard Le Bovier de Fontenelle in the 17th century. Indeed, all practitioners of the historian's craft, as Marc Bloch called it, recognize that few events in history took place precisely the way we learned about them in school, even in democratic countries, or how our parents or grandparents explained them. Confabulation, and whatever the motives of the fabulists or those who commissioned them, is a concept as old as the Apocrypha and even history itself. But it has particular consequences for those of us studying the Shoah. In a 2020 article entitled "Creating a Usable Past on Holocaust Denial and Distortion," published in the journal that I edit, Professor Judah Bauer, the doyen of Holocaust history, wrote, and I quote, the notion of a usable past is key. In order to fortify national consciousness, and therefore the nationalist political leadership, a past has to be found that can be used to educate, more precisely to indoctrinate the nation, young and old. When such an uplifting past is unavailable, it has to be invented. After all, the real past is always a mixture of the good, the bad, and everything in between. Distortion of the past rests on a combination of truth and invention. The story that results from that fusion, then, becomes a component of nationalist ideology. End of quote. I think that all of us, wherever we come from, will recognize the truth in that observation. Now, even before the Second World War ended and the ashes of the crematoria went cold, thought was given how these events would be interpreted and chronicled. And although Jews had been targeted for complete biological destruction, that is to say, every man, woman, and child born of Jewish parents was to be annihilated, that was rarely made clear, and much of the reportage and early literature de-emphasized the ethnic or religious background of the victims, who were shamelessly de-Judaized, for lack of a better word, and the anti-Semitic motive for their crime removed. For example, in one of the early books by a survivor of Auschwitz, a Jewish woman, Olga Lengyel, Five Chimneys, you would never have known that the protagonist was deported to Auschwitz as a Jew. The word hardly appears in the book. Now, this phenomenon was especially pronounced in the new people's democracies in Central and Eastern Europe, in which age-old Jewish communities had been obliterated, and the new authorities appropriated the Jewish dead as victims of the Nazi Germans or fascists and denuded them of their identity. Overnight, for example, Polish Jews who had never enjoyed real social acceptance in Polish society suddenly became Poles, which led the journalist Paul Lenve to write in his book, Anti-Semitism Without Jews, that dead Jews make good Poles. Now, another way to do that was to manipulate the statistics. So, for example, in Auschwitz, the number of victims was often listed at 4.5 million, many times the actual number that was killed. And I can tell you, as someone who has visited Auschwitz many times over the course of many decades, you can see the progress that has made since then. But I can tell you, way back when, there were national pavilions created to honor Hungarians, Romanians, Greeks, Yugoslavs, and even East Germans as the victims, but scarcely a mention that it were Jews that were the primary victims. Now, one would have believed, had one visited that place without knowing anything else, that in fact Auschwitz was primarily a place of martyrdom of Poles and of other European nationalities, and the Jewish dimension, we can say, was almost relegated to a footnote. Similar things happened in every communist country, though each has its own, well, we can call it local topography. Obviously, the story of countries which preserved their independence or acquired it under Nazi auspices, collaborated with the Germans, was different than countries which were directly occupied, not only in terms of what we might call agency, but it was always the party, doesn't matter in what situation, that determined what narrative would emerge, and it had to be one that was, again, to quote Professor Bauer, usable in advancing its own political agenda. Now, at the outset of my presentation today, I spoke about the late Professor Shafir. Now, he created a number of categories to describe the various manifestations of the pathology about which I am speaking today, and it's useful to record them, or to recall them. The first, selective negationism. Yes, the Holocaust did take place, but it most certainly didn't happen in our country. For example, this is something you could find quite a lot in Romania, and you sometimes still find it. Now, I can remember, for example, in the beginning of the 1990s, in a conversation with a Romanian diplomat, in fact, it was the ambassador of Romania in Israel, who told me there was no Holocaust in Romania. It would be a mistake to refer to a Holocaust in Romania. And he said this to me at the cocktail reception, and I said to him, Ambassador, please, I think you are too smart to think that I am that stupid. And he was, of course, quite taken aback. The next category, deflective negationism. Yes, Jews were killed in our country, but others were entirely responsible. It wasn't us. It was the Germans. No, certainly not our comrades from the GDR, who masterminded and executed the final solution. They were entirely responsible, and local people or authorities, local governments, the national government was not to blame. Thus, for example, during an official visit to Israel in 2011, Poland's then foreign minister, and I'm not referring to somebody from the peace government, Radosław Sikorski declared in an interview with the newspaper Haaretz, the Holocaust that took place on our soil was conducted against our will by someone else. Now he said that despite the fact that very courageous and iconoclastic Polish historians had already conducted extensive research demonstrating that the degree of Polish cooperation in the destruction of Jews in Poland was rather widespread and not at all a marginal phenomenon. And as most of you are probably aware, Poland's nationalist government, which was just defeated in elections, enacted an anti-defamation law, sometimes called the Holocaust law, in January of 2018, aimed at those who slander the good name of the Polish nation and who blame Polish society for crimes committed by the Nazi Third Reich, and basically prosecutes anybody who dare suggest that Poles have any degree of culpability. Now let me make clear, quite understandably, the German government generally, and what one can say rightfully, will never dare to identify the misdeeds of their ancestors, auxiliaries, accessories, enablers, or allies, because it would appear then that they are attempting to evade their own responsibility for the Holocaust, which of course they cannot do. But this is taken advantage of by the people who are committing the acts to which I refer. Then there is what Professor Shafir called comparative trivialization. This could also be characterized as comparative or competitive martyrdom. In other words, comparing the suffering of Jews with others who it is said suffered no less or more in the same period, whether under the Germans or the Soviets. And this phenomenon also is especially widespread in the Baltic states, in Poland and elsewhere. It was given a boost by this Prague Declaration, which introduced the European Day of Remembrance for victims of Stalinism and Nazism. It's also referred to as the Europe-wide Day of Remembrance for the victims of all totalitarian and authoritarian regimes, lumping together the victims of all these terrible crimes and, of course, blurring the distinction between them. Now, some of you may have heard this famous Radio Yerevan aphorism, what is the hardest thing to predict under communism? Answer, the past. In fact, where the Shoah is concerned, it hasn't been all that difficult to predict the past, though obviously certain nuances are evident, dependent on changes in the leadership and the resultant ambiance in various countries. In the Polish case, though not only, and let me point this out, it's quite interesting, the communists and the anti-communists who were in exile in London, in Washington and other places actually found common ground. In both cases, their writings reflected a tendency to minimize the culpability of local society in crimes committed against the Jews. It said that anybody who did such a thing, really it was aberrant behavior, and magnified the number of local people who, at risk of their life, engaged in providing assistance to Jews, depicting it as a widespread phenomenon, absolutely common, rather than something quite marginal, quite exceptional, and indeed very heroic. And of course, there was no reference to the idea that one could have been a fighter in the underground, struggling against the German occupants tooth and nail, but at the same time engaged in the destruction and despoliation of the Jewish neighbors, because there was no sense that there was a contradiction in this, and this of course leads to a widespread phenomenon throughout this neighborhood, which is glorification of the perpetrators, as long as those perpetrators were also involved in the struggle for national freedom and the struggle against the communists. So this paradigm is something we can observe in many countries. Of course, as I indicated, it always reflects the prevailing local conditions, but indeed it's something worthy of study. Of course, I would be remiss were I not to mention the post-Yugoslav case, and here I don't pretend to have any expertise. It's of course especially complex, but one that's very striking concerns Jasenovac, in which some 80 to 100,000 people perished, mainly Serbs, but also Roma and Jews, which I visited some years ago, and of course I was quite shocked at what I found. On the one hand, the Croatian narrative, which attempts to minimize the number of victims and to utterly whitewash the culpability of the Ustaše perpetrators, even going so far in some circles as to depict the camp as some safe haven or sanctuary, really quite appalling. But on the other side of the coin is one that's advanced in certain nationalist circles, sometimes in the Republika Srpska from the literature I have seen, which grossly inflates the number of victims. So you have, for example, the Israeli historian Gidon Greif, who says that the number of people who perished in Jasenovac was 700,000 or more. This, of course, is a classic case of seeking to create usable history to advance this or that political agenda. I would end by drawing your attention to the two greatest challenges we face as scholars today, no matter where we live in the world. The first is Wikipedia, the greatest wellspring of information ever created by mankind, and one which has extraordinary influence. It is the 7th most visited site on the internet, 7.3 billion views a month. Its articles show up in over 80% of the first page of search engine results and over 50% of the top 3 results. In most cases, it is the first and only place that people will seek to learn about history. Speak to most people, and if they're curious about some event in history, the first place they go is Google. Google directs them to Wikipedia, and that's where the search begins and also where it ends. I would argue we have an extraordinary responsibility to monitor Wikipedia in all the languages in which it appears to ensure that what is put out there is correct. And I can tell you from my own very limited experience, there are many egregious, even appalling bits of information that are posted on Wikipedia, and it is very difficult to expunge it. And I can tell you from first-hand experience, at least in the Polish case, it has really become something like a pandemic. We should also be concerned about something else, and that is artificial intelligence, which to my mind is no match for natural stupidity, but can certainly be used to manipulate history. We are only just seeing the beginning of that, but something that we must all be very vigilant, because it's no problem to take a film of a famous figure and put words in his mouth, and then we are going to have to argue that this is fraudulent. And you go figure out how to do that. I haven't found a way. Now one may ask, why are we getting so worked up about all of this? It's close to 80 years after the killings here ceased. Well, permit me to quote George Eliot, the author of the famous British novel Middlemarch, and she wrote, "Our deeds still travel with us from afar, and what we have been makes us what we are." That, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Weinbaum.